Claire and David Dawson thought they lived an ordinary life in quiet Maplewood, but one stolen photograph and a missing husband would soon reveal a shocking secret. The man Claire loved wasn't who he claimed to be, and the truth behind his identity would unravel a web of murder, deception, and betrayal no one saw coming. The small town of Maplewood was the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. It sat quietly between rolling hills and dense woods, where neighbors knew each other's names and children played freely in the streets until the sun went down. Most houses were decades old, passed down through generations, and the residents took pride in their safety. For years, the police department handled little more than traffic violations and the occasional noise complaint. That's why, on an unusually cold October night, the emergency line ringing with a call about a home invasion caught everyone off guard. The voice on the other end was shaky but clear. Claire Dawson, a nurse who lived on Cedar Lane, reported that someone had broken into her home. She explained that she had just returned from a late hospital shift to find her front door ajar. The porch light flickered weakly, and inside shadows stretched across the walls as if something had disturbed them. Her voice trembled as she described drawers pulled open, clothes tossed around, and the strange sense that someone had been there recently. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the scene. The officers entered cautiously, flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of floorboards beneath their feet. At first glance, it looked like a typical burglary, until they started to notice what was missing. Claire stood by the doorway, clutching her jacket, watching the officers move from room to room. They checked the master bedroom, the kitchen, the study. Jewelry boxes sat open but full, a laptop rested untouched on the desk, and cash in a glass jar remained in plain sight. Whoever had entered the home hadn't taken anything valuable. Then one officer pointed to the empty space on the living room wall. A clean rectangle of lighter paint marked where a picture frame had once hung. Claire frowned, realizing the photo of her and her husband David, taken on their second wedding anniversary, was gone. It wasn't a valuable photo, just a simple picture of them smiling on a beach, but it was the only item missing. The officer made a note, puzzled. Why would anyone break into a house to steal a single framed photograph? Outside, the night air was still. The neighbors had gathered quietly, whispering among themselves, surprised that something like this could happen on their street. Police asked if anyone had seen anything unusual, but most were asleep or watching TV at the time. One neighbor mentioned hearing a car engine late at night, but couldn't describe the vehicle. Another thought she'd seen a figure walking toward the Dawsons' house earlier in the evening, but brushed it off as nothing. The police filed the report as a strange but low-priority burglary. They promised to keep watch for any suspicious activity, though few believed it was anything serious. Claire tried to convince herself the same, but unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had entered her home hadn't it been after money or valuables. The missing photo, the open drawers, the faint scent of cologne that wasn't her husband's. It all seemed deliberate, as if someone had been looking for something specific. That night, as she locked the doors and turned out the lights, Claire stood in front of the empty space on the wall for a long time. The silence felt heavy. She didn't know it then, but the strange burglary on Cedar Lane would be the first thread in a dark and tangled web, one that would soon pull her into a mystery deeper than she could ever imagine. 2 days after the burglary, the quiet tension that had settled over Claire Dawson's home took a darker turn. That morning, she woke to find David, her husband, nowhere in the house. At first, she thought he might have gone out early for errands or a jog, as he often did, but as the hours passed, worry began to creep in. His car remained parked in the driveway, a thick layer of dew covering the windshield, untouched since the night before. His phone lay on the counter, charging as if he had left it there in the middle of a routine, and his wallet rested beside it. There was no note, no explanation, no indication that he had planned to leave for long. Claire's anxiety grew as she searched the house, calling his name and peering into closets the basement, and every corner of the rooms. The neighbors were beginning to notice her distress, but no one had seen anything unusual. By mid-morning, she reported David missing to the Maplewood Police Department. Officers arrived quickly, taking details about his appearance, last known movements, and habits. They treated the situation with care, aware that missing person cases could turn dangerous very quickly. Investigators initially considered the possibility that David had run off or met with an accident while jogging. They searched the nearby trails, the winding paths that led into the dense Maplewood woods, and the small parks scattered around the town. Teams combed the areas for signs of him, checking under bridges, near streams, and even in abandoned cabins that dotted the outskirts. There was no trace, no discarded clothing, no footprints leading anywhere. It was as if David had vanished into thin air. As the search continued, detectives began to connect the missing person case to the earlier burglary. The stolen photograph, previously dismissed as a minor curiosity, suddenly seemed significant. They reviewed the security cameras from the street and neighboring houses. On one grainy clip, a dark figure could be seen approaching the Dawsons' house on the night of the break-in. The figure moved with caution, stopping briefly to glance around before entering the home. What made the officers uneasy was that the person used a key to unlock the door, not forcing it, but turning it smoothly in the lock. This detail shifted the theory of the case dramatically. The burglary was no longer a random act of crime. Whoever had entered the house knew the Dawsons intimately, had access to their home, and had a specific purpose. Detectives began to dig into the couple's relationships, work colleagues, and even acquaintances from David's past. They wanted to understand why anyone would take only a single photo and leave all other valuables untouched. Meanwhile, Claire's anxiety deepened. The police presence at her home brought little comfort. The thought that someone who had entered her house knew David and might be responsible for his disappearance was terrifying. The same neighbors who had watched the first burglary unfold now kept their doors locked and eyes alert. Maplewood, once a place of safety and routine, was beginning to feel like a town under siege. The missing photo, the unexplained disappearance, and the blurred figure on the security footage became the central mystery. Every detail seemed connected, yet nothing made sense. The investigation was no longer about a single strange burglary. It had become a race to find a missing man, and every passing hour increased the sense of urgency. The officers knew that the deeper they dug, the more they would uncover about a story far stranger and darker than anyone in Maplewood could have anticipated. As the investigation into David Dawson's disappearance continued, detectives decided to examine the house with greater scrutiny. At first, the home seemed ordinary, neat, well-kept, with no obvious signs of secret activity. But police forensics are trained to notice what most people overlook, and they quickly spotted small inconsistencies. The basement floorboards were slightly uneven in one corner, and the walls had subtle patches of fresh paint that didn't match the surrounding surfaces. These minor details, unnoticed by anyone living there, suggested something hidden beneath the surface. A team carefully removed the floorboards in the basement, revealing a concealed compartment built into the subfloor. Inside, they found items that immediately shifted the case from a simple burglary to something much more sinister. There were stacks of old photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges, showing people whose faces had been scratched out. A small leather-bound diary sat in the corner, filled with meticulously written entries in a cramped hand, and tucked inside a tiny wooden box with a false bottom lay a USB drive, wrapped in a thin layer of cloth as if to protect it from discovery. Once the drive was plugged into a secure police computer, investigators discovered a trove of encrypted files. It took days for specialists to decode them, but what they eventually uncovered was astonishing. The folders contained detailed records of forged documents, false identities, and extensive financial fraud. There were passports with different names, but matching photographs, bank statements with altered account numbers, and driver's licenses that could pass as legitimate under casual inspection. Each file was linked to a single name, David Dawson, the very man who was now missing. As detectives pored over the information, they realized that the David Dawson they had been looking for was not who he claimed to be. The photographs, coupled with the identification documents, revealed discrepancies. The man in the images had different features, a slightly different build, and even minor scars that did not match the missing person's known records. The house itself seemed to have been used as a hub for illegal activity, a secret base where someone could manage multiple false identities without drawing attention. Investigators began cross-referencing the documents with criminal databases and quickly uncovered the shocking truth. David Dawson had assumed an identity that belonged to someone else, a man who had reportedly died years earlier under mysterious circumstances. The man living with Claire, the husband she loved and trusted, was not the man he appeared to be. Instead, he was a career con artist who had taken over the life of another person, meticulously erasing his own past to hide in plain sight. The implications were staggering. Everything about the burglary and disappearance had to be reconsidered. The single missing photograph, once thought to be an odd target, now appeared to hold a secret, perhaps proof of the husband's true identity. Every drawer rifled through, every small disturbance in the house took on new meaning. Someone had been searching not for valuables, but for evidence, for proof that could expose a carefully constructed lie. The town of Maplewood, previously unaware of anything beyond minor disturbances, was on the brink of uncovering a deception far more intricate than anyone could have imagined. The case had grown from a simple missing person report into a labyrinth of stolen identities, hidden compartments, and carefully concealed digital evidence. And yet, detectives knew that this revelation was only the beginning. The next discovery would challenge everything they thought they knew about David Dawson and the life he had built with Claire. As detectives continued to follow the trail of false identities and forged documents, the shocking truth about David Dawson began to take shape. Cross-referencing the files on the USB drive with law enforcement databases across multiple states, they discovered that the man living with Claire was not David Dawson at all. His real identity was Eric Nolan, a career con artist who had been on the run for years, wanted for fraud, forgery, and identity theft in several states. Eric had carefully studied the life of David Dawson, learning his habits, his work history, and even his relationships before assuming his identity and moving into the quiet Maplewood neighborhood. The revelation left the police both amazed and horrified. Claire had unknowingly married a man who was a master of deception, someone capable of living a double life without raising suspicion. The burglary, the missing photograph, and the disappearance all suddenly seemed to fit a larger, more sinister plan. The photo stolen from the living room wall was not taken at random. It appeared to be a piece of evidence, something that could link Eric to the identity of David Dawson, or perhaps to the illegal activities he was hiding. While tracing Eric Nolan's history, investigators uncovered more unsettling facts. The man he had replaced, the real David Dawson, had supposedly died 3 years earlier in a boating accident. But as detectives dug deeper, discrepancies in the official accident report emerged. Witnesses who had been at the lake that day gave conflicting statements, and no body had ever been recovered. It was possible that David Dawson's death had been staged, a cover for something far darker. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A hiker exploring a remote trail near Maplewood stumbled upon what appeared to be a shallow grave, partially covered with leaves and soil. Local authorities were called, and when the area was excavated, human remains were recovered. DNA testing confirmed a shocking fact. The remains belonged not to Eric Nolan, but to the real David Dawson. Somehow, the man who had supposedly died years ago in a boating accident had lived long enough to encounter Eric Nolan. The implications were staggering. David Dawson had survived his faked death and then been confronted by the man who had taken over his identity. Detectives began piecing together a timeline of events. After the boating accident that was meant to end his life on paper, David Dawson had survived, only to be discovered by Eric Nolan. Instead of fleeing or exposing him, Eric had killed David, taking over his life permanently. This explained why the stolen photo had been the only item removed during the initial burglary. It was the one piece of evidence that connected Eric to the true identity of David Dawson. Every other valuable in the house was left untouched because the intruder had only one goal: to secure control over the secret that could unravel everything. The quiet town of Maplewood was now at the center of a crime far more elaborate than anyone could have imagined. A man thought dead had been murdered to cover up his identity, and a con artist had infiltrated a home, a marriage, and a community, living undetected for years. The peaceful streets and familiar neighbors had concealed a dark story of deception, survival, and murder, one that would challenge every assumption about who could be trusted. The truth was more twisted than anyone could have foreseen, and the police knew that even with the discovery of the real David Dawson's remains, the full story was far from over. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place as detectives reconstructed the chain of events that had led to the shocking series of crimes. David Dawson had staged his own death in the boating accident years earlier, creating the illusion that he was gone forever. This had allowed him to escape mounting debts, threats from creditors, and possible legal trouble. The plan had seemed foolproof, leaving the world to believe he was dead while he quietly disappeared from public view. But fate, or perhaps bad luck, brought him into contact with Eric Nolan, a con artist who had built a life on stealing identities and deceiving those around him. Eric had carefully studied David's disappearance, learning everything about his life and using it to construct the perfect facade. When he located David, he didn't immediately reveal himself. Instead, he waited, observing, planning, and ultimately killing the man whose identity he intended to take over. Eric assumed David Dawson's name and life completely, moving into the house on Cedar Lane, marrying Claire, and integrating himself into the community as a law-abiding husband. To outsiders, he was David Dawson, the same man whose life had seemed ordinary and unremarkable. The burglary that had initially triggered the investigation was, in reality, David's last attempt to expose the truth. Somehow, after years of hiding, he had returned, determined to reclaim his identity and reveal Eric's crimes. The missing photograph became a critical piece of evidence because it contained proof that only David could have left. Fingerprints hidden beneath the glass that connected Eric to the crime of identity theft. The burglary was not about theft in the traditional sense. It was a desperate move to retrieve evidence and reclaim a life that had been stolen. But Eric was meticulous and ruthless. He discovered David's return and the attempted recovery of proof before the authorities were alerted. In a brutal confrontation, Eric killed David for a second and final time, ensuring that no one could uncover the truth. He buried the body in a shallow grave near the forest trail where David had supposedly vanished during a jog. The layers of deception had been carefully orchestrated to leave no trace, making it appear that David had disappeared under mysterious circumstances while hiding his criminal activities. The revelation shook the Maplewood community to its core. The man they had trusted and welcomed into their homes had been living a lie for years, and the quiet neighborhood that prided itself on safety had become the stage for a carefully executed crime of identity theft and murder. Investigators realized that Eric's ability to blend into the town, combined with David's faked death, had created the perfect cover for a crime so intricate that it seemed almost impossible. Claire Dawson was left grappling with the horrifying truth. The husband she had loved and trusted was a stranger, a killer who had stolen someone else's identity and built a life on deception. The single missing photograph, a small and seemingly insignificant object, had been the key that unraveled the entire scheme. From a simple burglary call, the investigation had uncovered a story of faked deaths, stolen identities, and murder that no one in Maplewood could have imagined. The layers of planning and betrayal revealed a dark truth. Even the most ordinary lives could hide extraordinary secrets, and sometimes the smallest clues could expose the most shocking crimes.